The sunlight generously poured through the magnificent bay window of the manor, spreading over every inch of the corner. The entire room seemed like a treasure chest that had been illuminated, full of brilliance. Juan was standing at the doorframe of the living room, like a guardian and also like a spectator. The coffee cup in his hand was gently emitting steam. That wisp of white smoke rose up and, under the reflection of the sunlight, was as dreamy as a fantasy. His gaze was intertwined with pride and a hint of mischievousness, looking at the chaotic scene in the room like ants on a hot pan, with a mixture of feelings in his heart. "Dad, have you seen my earrings?" This voice was like a sharp arrow, suddenly coming from upstairs, followed closely by a rush of footsteps, as rapid as drum beats, da-da-da, constantly ringing on the stairs. Juan looked up and saw Kora rushing downstairs like a whirlwind. The silk nightgown behind her fluttered freely like wings. Juan's heart gave a thump, but his expression remained calm. He took a gentle sip of his coffee and said slowly, "Look on the dresser in your room, dear." As soon as Kora heard this, she stomped her feet in a hurry, waving her hands randomly in the air as if trying to disperse this annoyance. "It's not there. I'm going to be late. Why is everything going wrong today?" Her voice carried a sob, and her eyes were full of anxiety and grievance, as if the world was about to collapse. Juan hurriedly put down the coffee cup and quickly walked to Kora's side. He gently patted Kora's shoulder and comforted, "Don't worry. Take a deep breath first. I'll help you find it." He thought to himself, "This child always panics when encountering things. We can't let this small trouble affect such an important day today." At this moment, Lucia came slowly from the corridor like an elegant fairy. The dress she wore fit her figure perfectly. With her steps, it gently swayed, making a subtle rustling sound, as if humming a silent song. Her hair was neatly arranged. Each strand seemed to have been carefully positioned. Her makeup was even more exquisite and elegant. Just right, like a delicate painting. "What happened?" Her voice was as gentle as water, and at the same time, she gently placed a hand on Kora's shoulder. The movement was so gentle as if afraid of disturbing a frightened fawn. "The earrings are gone." Kora's tone was full of frustration, like a deflated balloon. "I'm sure I put them on the dresser, but now I just can't find them." Lucia slightly frowned, and her eyes quickly met with Juan's for a moment, then said, "Go and look in the car. Maybe they fell out when we were moving the gifts yesterday." Juan listened, without saying a word, nodded, and turned towards the kitchen. As he walked, he was thinking in his heart, where could these earrings have gone? We can't let any mistakes happen. Kora can't have any regrets today. He picked up the keys from the kitchen counter and strode outside. The cold air in the early morning was like a group of naughty elves, suddenly pouncing on Juan, making him shiver involuntarily. But at the same time, it also relieved him from the heat and annoyance in the room. He walked to the trunk of the car, took a deep breath as if pumping himself up, and then opened the trunk. It was filled with all kinds of bags, like mysterious treasure bags. Juan bent down, carefully searching among the bags, his eyes like searchlights, not letting go of any corner. Finally, between two large packages, he found a small velvet box. Juan let out a long sigh and a relieved smile appeared on his face. He said silently in his heart, "Finally found it. This little thing almost caused big trouble." He gently picked up the box and turned to go back to the house. Seeing Juan coming back with the box, Kora's eyes instantly lit up. That glow was like the brightest star in the night sky. "Dad, you're my savior," she excitedly shouted, grabbed the box, and turned to rush upstairs like an agile rabbit, leaving only a hasty "thank you" echoing in the air. Juan looked at Kora's back, chuckled softly, and his heart was full of doting. He thought, this child is always so impetuous, but as long as she's happy, it's fine. Lucia walked to Juan's side, with that gentle smile like the spring breeze on her face. "Everything is perfect, Juan. Thank you for all your efforts." Juan listened, slightly shook his head, looked at the busy people in the room, and said slowly, "This isn't the credit of me alone. This is for our family, for Kora. She deserves such a wedding." His heart was full of affection for this family and satisfaction from his efforts. Although preparing for the wedding was very hard, as long as the family was happy, everything was worth it. Lucia nodded, but Juan acutely noticed a hint of imperceptible unease flashing in her eyes, like a sudden ripple on a calm lake surface. Juan couldn't help but wonder in his heart. He thought, what's wrong with Lucia? Does she have something on her mind? But he quickly dismissed this thought. He told himself that today was Kora's big day. We can't let anything ruin this beautiful moment. Thus, he buried this doubt deep in his heart, threw himself back into the preparations for the wedding, and his face regained that composed expression. But deep in his heart, it was like a lake's surface that had been disturbed by a small pebble, unable to calm down for a long time. The wheel of time rolled slowly, and the preparations for the wedding became increasingly tense. The manor seemed to have turned into a busy beehive. Everyone was like a diligent bee, performing their own duties and going all out for the upcoming grand moment. Juan was even like a tireless top, constantly spinning among the crowd. His eyes were as sharp as an eagle, carefully inspecting every detail, for fear of any mistakes. "Dad, where should we put the photo booth?" Max's voice broke through the busy noise. He was like a strongman, dragging a heavy box and slowly walking into the living room. His forehead was full of sweat, and he asked breathlessly. Juan raised his head, thought for a moment, pointed to the corner next to the terrace with his finger and said, "Put it there, Max. That corner has plenty of light. The photos taken there will surely be great, and the guests will like to take pictures there." Max listened, nodded, and then shouted at the top of his lungs, "Jordan, come and help me! This box is too heavy." The two brothers began to argue about how to carry the equipment. They exchanged words and refused to give in to each other. Juan looked at them, the corners of his mouth slightly raised, revealing an imperceptible smile. A warm current welled up in his heart, and his thoughts drifted away. He remembered the scenes when the brothers played and got into trouble together when they were young. How innocent they were at that time. Now they have grown up and can help with the wedding preparations. How time flies. Although their argument was a bit noisy, this kind of lively atmosphere of the family made Juan feel extremely precious. It seemed that this was the taste of home, full of the hustle and bustle, and the bond of family affection. Juan walked out of the house and came to the garden. The garden was full of blooming flowers, like a sea of flowers. The florists were like a group of diligent flower fairies, busily arranging the last batch of white roses. Those roses were charming and tender, with morning dew still on the petals. Under the sunlight, they sparkled with crystal clear light and emitted a charming fragrance, as if they were blessing the newlyweds. The chefs were like a group of magic chefs, unloading plates of exquisite food from the car. The food emitted an inviting aroma, making people's mouths water. The photographer was like a nimble elf, swiftly shuttling among the crowd, capturing every precious moment. His lens was like a magical eye, recording every smile and every look of the family. When Juan was immersed in this beautiful scene, suddenly, a familiar figure appeared in his line of sight. It was Matthew, who was strolling leisurely along the driveway. Matthew was wearing a custom-made suit. The lines of the suit were smooth and fit his figure perfectly. Every stitch and thread showed delicacy and luxury. His leather shoes were polished so brightly that they shone in the sunlight. His face wore that signature charming smile, as bright as the sun, as if it could dispel all the haze in the world. Over the years, his smile has always been his charm card. Wherever he went, he could attract everyone's attention. "I think we'll need this." Matthew was like a cheerful Santa Claus, holding up a bottle of champagne high, and his voice was hearty and full of pleasure, breaking the surrounding silence. "You always think of everything." Juan replied with a smile. He walked forward and patted Matthew hard on the back. The sound was like a close greeting between friends. "How have you been recently?" Juan asked, with a hint of concern in his eyes. After all, Matthew was his friend for many years. Although he had been extremely busy preparing for the wedding recently, he still cared about Matthew's life. "You know me." Matthew winked, with a hint of mystery and confidence in his eyes. "Living the dream life." His tone was relaxed and carefree, as if there were no troubles in the world that could bother him. They stood there and chatted briefly for a while. Then Lucia appeared. When Lucia saw Matthew, her eyes instantly lit up like bulbs, full of surprise and joy. "You're here." Her tone was exceptionally warm, as if welcoming a long-lost relative. She quickly stepped forward and gave Matthew a quick and intimate hug without hesitation. "We have a lot to talk about. Don't disappear before the wedding banquet." Her voice carried a hint of coquettishness and anticipation, as if Matthew were her closest confidant. "I wouldn't dare." Matthew replied with a smile, his smile even brighter, and a hint of a different emotion flashed in his eyes that was hard to notice. Juan stood aside and quietly watched their interaction. Suddenly, an inexplicable unease welled up in his heart, like a dark cloud covering the sunlight in his heart. He secretly asked himself in his heart, why do they seem so close? Is it just because of their long-standing friendship? He tried to convince himself that Lucia and Matthew had always had a good relationship and there was nothing surprising about it. But that feeling of unease was like an invisible small hand, tightly grasping his heart and never letting go. Soon, it was time for the wedding ceremony. The guests were like a group of cheerful birds, gathering in the garden from all directions. Rows of white chairs were neatly arranged, like a white ocean, and were quickly filled. Juan sat in the front row and his heart involuntarily beat faster, like a small drum was beating. His palms sweated slightly. He was both nervous and excited. Lucia sat quietly beside him. Her face wore a faint smile, but her eyes were somewhat erratic. When the music played, Kora walked slowly along the easel like a beautiful princess. Her wedding dress was like a flowing galaxy, shining with dazzling light in the sunlight. Every crystal was like a brilliant star. The hem of the dress gently swayed with her steps as if dancing. Her face was filled with a happy smile. That smile was brighter than the sun and more charming than the flowers. Juan looked at his daughter and his heart was like a bottle of mixed emotions overturned, with all kinds of emotions welling up. He remembered the way Kora first learned to walk when she was a child, that staggering but determined pace. He remembered the first time she called Dad, that tender and sweet voice. His throat seemed to be blocked by something and his eyes became slightly moist. He thought silently in his heart, "My little daughter has finally grown up. Today is the most important moment in her life. I must protect her well." When exchanging vows, Juan's thoughts were like a runaway wild horse, briefly drifting back to the bits and pieces of his hard work for this family over the years. He remembered those countless days and nights of hard work. In order to give his family a better life, he tirelessly rushed about. He remembered the difficulties and setbacks he had encountered before. Each time was like a steep mountain peak, difficult to overcome, but he gritted his teeth and persisted. He also remembered the warm times his family spent with him, those laughter and those hugs, which were all his motivation to move forward. However, that hint of unease still remained like a hidden snake in the grass, quietly coiling in his heart. He always felt that something was not right, like a hidden undercurrent beneath the calm sea surface, ready to set off huge waves at any time. After the ceremony ended, the guests applauded warmly, and the applause sounded like thunder. Juan also applauded. He tried hard to throw those disturbing thoughts to the far corners of the sky, like driving away a group of annoying flies. He told himself that today was a joyous day and could not be spoiled by those inexplicable feelings. The family gathered together for photos. Juan watched the children laughing and chatting with Matthew. Their laughter was as clear and pleasant as silver bells. Somehow, the closeness between them made him feel a bit strange, like an incongruous color suddenly appearing in a beautiful painting. He tried to ignore this feeling again and kept telling himself in his heart, "It must be that I'm overthinking. Today is to celebrate my daughter's wedding for this family that I have worked hard to build. I can't let these groundless suspicions spoil this beautiful moment." At this moment, he just wanted to keep everything seemingly perfect as it was, like guarding a precious porcelain, being cautious. But unexpectedly, those hidden cracks were about to completely shatter everything and plunge his world into endless darkness and pain. The garden, under the gentle caress of the sunlight, was like a fairyland in a dream, so beautiful that it took one's breath away. The white roses were elegantly arranged along the passageway, like a group of holy angels in white, quietly guarding this happy territory. Their fragrance was like a soft veil, interweaving with the fresh autumn air and creating a picturesque and wonderful scene. The guests, dressed in magnificent clothes and wearing smiles, shuttled back and forth in the garden. Their laughter and chatters were like a cheerful stream, flowing and echoing in the air, forming a lively and vibrant picture. Juan held a glass of champagne. The bubbles in the glass were jumping merrily, just like the beautiful visions he once had for this family. He slowly paced among the crowd. Each step seemed to step on the strings of time, making gentle echoes. With a warm smile, that smile was like the warm sun in winter. He greeted his relatives and friends one by one. Kora's wedding, this moment he had carefully prepared for a long time, was just as he expected, perfect like a scene from a fairy tale. It was the crystal of happiness, exchanged for his years of hard work and dedication. His gaze gently shifted among the crowd and soon caught the familiar figures. He saw his children Kora, Max Bell, Jordan and Lucas, were like a group of cheerful fawns gathering near the fountain. They surrounded Matthew, their faces filled with unrestrained laughter. That laughter seemed to be the most beautiful melody in the world. Matthew was like an excellent storyteller, vividly telling one fascinating story after another. His gestures were rich and exaggerated, and his eyes sparkled with unique charm, making the children mesmerized. Juan's heart was originally full of relief and satisfaction. Seeing his children getting along so well with his best friend, he seemed to see a beautiful picture of family harmony and deep friendship unfolding slowly before his eyes. This had always been a scene he cherished and yearned for, the image of a happy family in his heart. However, in this seemingly harmonious and perfect moment, an inadvertent detail was like a sharp lightning, instantly splitting the peaceful sky in his heart. He noticed Lucia's figure. She was walking towards Matthew with light and elegant steps. Her steps seemed natural and ordinary, but under Juan's sharp gaze, they seemed to hide some indescribable purpose. When she reached Matthew's side, her arm, like a flexible snake, slowly wrapped around Matthew's neck, and then their lips touched without scruple. At that moment, time seemed to freeze and the whole world became distorted and blurry in Juan's eyes. Juan couldn't believe his eyes. His brain seemed to suddenly short-circuit and went blank. He kept asking himself in his heart, "Is this real? Am I dreaming? This must be a nightmare. Wake me up quickly." His body trembled slightly and his feet seemed to be nailed to the ground, unable to move an inch. His gaze was tightly fixed on the two of them, and all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. That sound echoed like thunder in his chest, making him almost unable to think. The laughter and music around gradually became distant and blurry, as if separated by an invisible barrier. His ears seemed to automatically shield all distractions, only focusing on catching the voices of Lucia and Matthew. Lucia's voice was very low as the buzz of a mosquito, but under Juan's highly concentrated hearing at this moment, it was as clear as thunder. Can you believe it? He still thinks he's raising his own children till now. Lucia's mouth curved into a sly and triumphant smile. That smile was like the devil's smile in Juan's eyes, full of malice and mockery. We deceived him for so many years, saying the surgery was successful. They are all your children, baby. Now this fool even funded this luxurious $1 million wedding. When Juan felt as if an invisible big hand was tightly grasping his chest. That big hand seemed to crush his heart. His breathing became rapid and heavy, like struggling in the oxygen-deficient deep sea. His hands involuntarily clenched into fists and his nails deeply embedded in the palms. The sharp pain, however, could not relieve the pain and anger in his heart at all. He roared in his heart, "Why? Why did you do this to me? All these years of feelings, were they all fake?" At this time, the youngest son Lucas spoke. His tone was relaxed as if he was talking about an insignificant matter, but with a hint of mockery that chilled Juan's heart. "We pretended to be good kids with him. Anyway, Uncle Matthew is our biological father." These words were like sharp and heavy hammers, smashing hard on Juan's heart. He staggered backward a step, as if hit by a powerful force. His vision became blurry and tears welled up in his eyes, but he forced himself not to let them fall. His mind was like an out-of-control projector and countless memories rushed in like a tide. Those once warm family dinners, when the family sat around, laughing and sharing the funny things of the day. Those joyous birthday parties, when the children's smiling faces were like blooming flowers, and he and Lucia watched happily aside. And those late nights when he and Lucia lay in bed, whispering about the children's future, their dreams, their hopes. At this moment, all of these had become a cruel and ridiculous farce, the biggest lie in his life. His breathing became even more rapid, like a person about to suffocate, struggling desperately for breath. He tried to piece together the fragments of the once seemingly complete and happy world in this chaos of memories and painful emotions, but he found that everything had already fallen apart and could not be restored. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne approached Juan quietly like a ghost, breaking his painful trance. "Sir, would you like another glass?" The waiter's voice was polite and respectful. Juan seemed to wake up from a nightmare. He slowly raised his hand and waved, his voice hoarse like the friction of worn-out sandpaper. "No thank you." His gaze remained dull, as if he had lost his soul. He turned and, like a robot, walked quickly towards the house. He had only one thought in his heart: find a place to calm himself down and think carefully about this sudden truth that was like the end of the world. He didn't know how to face all this. He only knew that his world, from this moment on, had completely collapsed. Or to the choice facing betrayal, Juan dragged his legs that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds and slowly walked into the house. Each step was like stepping on his broken heart. The hustle and bustle of the wedding behind him seemed to be separated by an invisible high wall, and instantly became weak and distant. Only his own heavy breathing echoed in this silent corridor. Inside the house, the refrigerator emitted a low hum, as if accompanying this oppressive atmosphere. The faint chatting sounds from the garden were like the murmurs of ghosts, making Juan even more annoyed. He numbly came to the kitchen and heavily placed the champagne glass in his hand, which was almost untouched, on the countertop. With a bang, it sounded particularly harsh in the silence. He tightly grasped the edge of the countertop with both hands. His knuckles turned white due to the force, as if only by doing this could he support his tottering body. He slightly arched his back, his head drooped powerlessly, and his listless eyes stared at the tiles under his feet, but his thoughts were like surging tides, running wild in his mind. How could this happen? Lucia, why did you do this? Matthew, I've always regarded you as my best friend. I trusted you so much. We've gone through so much together. Was all of this fake? Juan's heart was crying out in pain. Those sweet times spent with Lucia and the deep friendship with Matthew were now like sharp knives, stabbing his heart fiercely. Every time he recalled them, the pain intensified. He remembered when they walked along the seaside together, chatting about the future facing the sea breeze. Remembered when they encouraged and supported each other in difficult times. Those beautiful memories have now become the cruelest tricks. At this time, a burst of footsteps came. Juan slowly raised his head and saw Lucia walking into the kitchen. There was still that seemingly carefree smile on her face, as if nothing had happened. This made Juan feel a burst of anger and confusion. You're here. Why did you suddenly disappear? Her voice was still gentle, but to Juan, it was extremely hypocritical. There seemed to be a hint of imperceptible panic in her eyes, but she quickly concealed it. Juan endured the severe pain and anger in his heart and forced out a smile that was uglier than crying. Just wanted to get some air. There were too many things today. He thought to himself, how could she still pretend as if nothing happened? Doesn't she have a bit of conscience? How could she still smile when facing me? Lucia didn't seem to notice the ups and downs in Juan's heart. She nodded, turned around and poured herself a glass of wine. I know. Kora was so happy today. All of this is thanks to you. As she spoke, she gently took a sip of the wine and deliberately avoided Juan's gaze, not daring to look at him directly. Listening to her words, Juan only felt that every word was like a needle pricking his heart, extremely harsh and hypocritical. He stared at Lucia tightly. His gaze was like a sharp sword, wanting to penetrate her disguised mask and find even a hint of guilt. However, he was disappointed. Her expression remained calm like a still pool of water, without the slightest flaw. How could she be so calm? Is her heart made of stone? How could she betray me for so many years and still feel at ease? Juan was painfully thinking in his heart. Anger and sadness intertwined in his heart. Where did Matthew go? Juan asked. He tried to make his voice sound stable, but the slightly trembling tone still betrayed his excitement and anger. Lucia's eyes obviously flickered. She put down the wine glass and pretended to be calm and said, he might be with the children. You know how much the children like him. Juan nodded silently, a wave of uncontrollable bitterness welling up in his heart. Wes, they do like him very much. They like their real father, and I've been kept in the dark like a fool for so many years. He silently mocked himself in his heart. The pain in his heart was about to erupt like a volcano. Juan knew that he couldn't draw conclusions easily based on what he saw and heard. He needed conclusive evidence to make everything clear, and let them have no way to deny. Without saying a word, he turned and left the kitchen. Each step was firm and resolute, as if carrying a determination to die. He went upstairs, came to his office, closed the door and slowly slid to the ground with his back against the door. His body was like a fragile leaf, trembling helplessly in the wind, and tears finally couldn't help but burst out. After a while, he stood up, walked to the desk and turned on the computer. His hand trembled slightly on the mouse, as if the mouse weighed 1,000 pounds. Every click required all his strength. Over the years, he had always been a careful and cautious person, carefully keeping various records, medical files, financial statements, emails. He always felt that these things might come in handy at some crucial moment. Unexpectedly, now it was really this moment, and these records had become the tools to uncover the biggest lie in his life. He opened the folder where the children's medical files were stored. His eyes were tightly fixed on the screen, and his heart was beating rapidly, as if it was about to jump out of his throat. His fingers hesitated on the keyboard for a moment, and then he gathered the courage to start flipping through the records. Kora's file first came into view. It showed that she was born through in vitro fertilization technology. This was the difficult process he and Lucia had gone through together. But when he saw the timeline, his brows tightly wrinkled and his heart was filled with doubts. According to the records, before Kora was born, this surgery failed many times, which was completely inconsistent with what he remembered. His hand began to tremble violently, and he continued to view the following content. A DNA test result from a routine physical examination struck him like lightning, and he froze. He clearly remembered seeing this result at that time and didn't pay much attention to it. But now, these few words were like the death sentence of the god of death, clearly indicating the existence of parent-child differences. John's face turned pale. He couldn't believe his eyes. Mechanically, he then checked Max's file, followed by Belle's, Jordan's, and Lucas's. Without exception, the children had no blood relationship with him. This cruel truth was like a sharp blade, deeply stabbing into his heart, making him too painful to breathe. The betrayal was so blatant and undeniable. Lucia and Matthew carefully wove a huge web of lies, using his love and trust to play with him at their will. The huge blow almost made him collapse, but there was a stubborn flame burning deep in his heart. He would never let them destroy him so easily, especially not today, on his daughter's wedding day. Juan took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. He secretly swore in his heart, "I must make them pay for what they have done. I can't be defeated like this." He wiped the tears from his face, tidied his clothes, and then, like a soldier about to go to the battlefield, resolutely returned to the garden. At this moment, the ceremony was about to start again. The guests took their seats one after another, but no one noticed the upcoming storm. Lucia stood at the entrance, still radiant and graceful, as if nothing had changed. When she saw Juan coming back, she reached out to hold his hand. Juan let her hold it, although his hand was as cold as ice, as if from the cold of hell. His heart was filled with mixed feelings. Despite suffering such a heavy betrayal, his love for Lucia and the children was hard to dissipate in an instant. However, he also knew clearly that he couldn't and wouldn't ignore this cruel truth. The life he had painstakingly built turned out to be a huge lie, and now he had to face the consequences brought by this truth for himself and for them. Juan stood at the edge of the garden. The pain in his heart was like surging waves, almost drowning him. The laughter and chatters around seemed to come from another world, becoming distant and blurry. His world only had the endless pain and anger. His gaze was tightly fixed on Lucia and Matthew. They were chatting happily with Kora and the other children as if nothing had happened. This made Juan's blood boil in his veins. His hands were tightly clenched into fists and his nails deeply embedded in the palms. But he couldn't feel the pain because the pain in his heart had already overwhelmed everything. He took a deep breath and took a firm step forward. This step seemed to use up all his strength. In an instant, the laughter and chatters stopped abruptly. Juan's loud and angry voice broke the silence. "Stop everything." Everyone turned their heads one after another, their faces filled with confusion and surprise. The guests began to whisper to each other. The original happy smiles gradually disappeared and were replaced by unease and curiosity. "This wedding is cancelled." Juan's voice was firm and cold, like the judgment from hell. "After what I heard, there won't be any vows today." There were exclamations and whispers among the crowd. People looked at each other in disbelief. Kora's face turned as pale as paper. She tightly held the bouquet in her hand and asked in a trembling voice, "Dad, what are you talking about?" Juan's gaze was like a torch, staring straight at Lucia and Matthew. That gaze seemed to be able to penetrate their souls. "Ask your mother and Uncle Matthew. Or you'd better ask yourself who the dad you've been calling all these years really is." Lucia's face instantly lost its color. She took a step forward, raised her hands, seemingly trying to pacify Juan, but her hands were trembling slightly. "Juan, please don't make trouble here." Juan coldly laughed. The latter was full of bitterness and anger. "Make trouble, Lucia. It was already a huge mess the moment you decided to deceive and betray me many years ago. Tell them. Tell everyone the truth." Matthew tried to interject and stood between them. There was a hint of embarrassment and unease on his face. "Juan, maybe we should find a private place to talk properly." "Shut up, Matthew," Juan roared. His voice became even louder. "You have no qualification to act as a mediator after you did all these things." The discussions among the crowd grew louder, and the tense atmosphere filled the air. Everyone could feel Juan's anger and pain. Kora's hands kept trembling. She looked at her parents, her eyes full of confusion and fear. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Lucia's lips trembled but remained silent. Her silence undoubtedly gave the answer. Juan slowly turned to the children, his eyes full of pain and disappointment. That gaze seemed to be telling his sincere dedication over the years but ended up with such an outcome. You all knew, right? You've known for a long time but have been keeping it from me. Lucas, the youngest child, shifted his feet uneasily. The previous confidence had long disappeared. He lowered his head, not daring to look into Juan's eyes. Dad, It's complicated. Don't call me Dad. Juan's voice sounded like thunder. Apparently, I've never been your dad. The bouquet in Kora's hand dropped to the ground, and the petals scattered all over the place, just like her broken heart. Mom, is this true? Her voice was choked with sobs, and her eyes were filled with despair and helplessness. Lucia wanted to reach out to pull her daughter, but Kora took a step backward. I can explain. She stuttered, tears welling up in her eyes, but she knew that any explanation seemed pale and weak at this moment. Juan shook his head and clenched his fists by his side. Enough, Lucia. Stop lying. Admit it. Admit that you and Matthew have been treating me like a fool. Matthew's voice became somewhat defensive. He tried to defend himself. Juan, you're taking this too seriously. It's not the time or the place. You have no right to decide anything. Juan glared at him. His gaze seemed to be able to devour him. You ruined my family, my life. Now you must face the consequences. Kora's voice rang out in the chaos with a desperate tremble. What does this mean for the wedding, for us? Juan looked at her. His gaze softened a little, but his tone was still firm. There's no wedding, Kora. I can't stand here and pretend to celebrate a family built on lies. Lucia burst into tears. She slowly knelt down, covering her face with both hands. Juan, please forgive me. I made a mistake, but don't punish the children. They love you, loathe me. Juan angrily retorted. From your words, all I heard was that they laughed at me behind my back, pretended to be my children but knew the truth. Lucas took another step forward and said hesitantly, It's not like that, Dad. We didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't mean to. Juan repeated his words. His tone was full of sarcasm. Your mother and Matthew conspired to keep me in the dark. This is not just hurt. This is cruel. The guests began to leave one after another. Their low discussions drifted away with the wind, like sighs for this broken family. Juan took a deep breath and tried to make his voice calm, but his determination remained unchanged. Today, all of this is over. Kora, Max Bell, Jordan, Lucas, you are all adults. You can choose to be with your mother and Matthew, but don't expect me to be involved in your lives anymore. You made your choices. Kora burst into loud cries. The cries echoed in the garden as if they were the wails of this broken family. Juan turned and strode away without looking back. Each step was full of determination. His back looked lonely and resolute in the setting sun. Although the pain of betrayal still weighed heavily on his heart, there was one belief in his heart that was extremely clear. He would never be a pawn in their game again. The life he once built might have been a lie, but his future would be controlled by himself, away from deception and away from them. After the farce of the wedding, days seemed to have been pressed on the slow motion button. Every minute and every second was infinitely elongated in Juan's perception, becoming extremely long and tormenting. He often sat in that empty room, and the silence around him rushed towards him like a tide, tightly wrapping him. His eyes were empty and listless, looking at the family photo on the wall, and his thoughts involuntarily drifted back to the past. Why? Why did they do this to me? I gave everything, but in return, I got such betrayal. Juan cried out painfully in his heart. Every memory was like sprinkling salt on his unhealed wound. He remembered working day and night to give his family a better life. On those exhausted nights, he always told himself that everything was for this family, for the happiness of Lucia and the children. But now, all of this had turned into bubbles. He felt like an orphan abandoned by the world, wandering alone in the dark, unable to find a direction. However, Juan was not a person who would be easily defeated. After countless tossing and turning nights, a hint of firm flame gradually ignited in his eyes. I can't be ruined by them like this. I have to regain my own life, he secretly swore in his heart. The next morning, the sunlight spilled on Juan's face through the gap of the curtains. He sat early at the mahogany desk in the study at home. The coffee on the desk had long gone cold, but he didn't take a sip. The phone rang abruptly, breaking the silence in the room. The calm and professional voice of the lawyer came from the receiver, informing him that the divorce procedures could be initiated immediately. And given the current situation, they had sufficient evidence to build a strong litigation plan to make the betrayers receive the punishment they deserved. The lawyer also mentioned that the will would be modified according to Juan's request, excluding Lucia and those children who had no blood relationship with him from all rights and interests. Just do it like this. Juan responded coldly. His voice didn't have a hint of hesitation, as if pronouncing the death sentence of his past life. I want them to have nothing. No inheritance, no trust fund, nothing. They betrayed my trust and must pay the price for this. He held the phone receiver tightly. The veins on the back of his hand slightly protruded and his eyes revealed determination and anger. Later that day, Lucia rushed into his office like a whirlwind. Her hair was a little messy and her eyes were full of anger and despair, like a wild animal fox to a dead end. Juan, you're completely crazy. She forcefully closed the door behind her. The bang echoed in the silent office, like her angry shout. You can't just exclude the children from the will. They didn't do anything wrong. Juan leaned on the chair and looked at her expressionlessly, but there was like a storm raging in his heart. Didn't do anything wrong, he sneered in his heart. They deceived me for so many years and still say they didn't do anything wrong. He slowly said, Lucia, how can you still have the face to come and say these to me? For all these years, you've been planning all this behind my back with Matthew. What did you take me for? A stupid cash machine. His voice was calm, but every word was like a thorn, stabbing towards Lucia fiercely. Lucia's lips trembled slightly. She tried to explain, Juan, it's not what you think. I love you. It's just that some things happened unexpectedly. A hint of panic flashed in her eyes, and she didn't dare to look directly into Juan's eyes. Unexpected. Juan angrily stood up, supported his hands on the table, and leaned forward. Your children with Matthew. Is this also unexpected? You conspired to deceive me. Is this your so-called love? His voice got higher and higher, and his anger erupted like a volcano. Lucia was scared and took a step backward by Juan's anger. Tears welled up in her eyes. Juan, please don't do this to the children. They are innocent. They've always regarded you as their father, feather. Juan repeated with a bitter smile. They knew the truth long ago, but still pretended in front of me. Their laughter now echoes in my ears, all like ridicule to me. His heart was filled with pain and disappointment. The love for the children and the anger of being betrayed collided fiercely in his heart. After the confrontation with Lucia, Juan's life fell into a seemingly calm but undercurrent surging state. He began to re-examine his life, trying to walk out of the shadow of the past. One day, Juan was running in the park. His steps were heavy and firm. Each step was like saying goodbye to his past self. Sweat soaked his clothes, but he didn't have the slightest intention to stop. At this time, his phone suddenly rang. It was an old friend Peter who he hadn't contacted for a long time. Juan, long time no see! How have you been recently? Peter's voice was warm and friendly. Juan was slightly stunned and a complex emotion welled up in his heart. He remembered that in the past days, because he was busy with his family, he ignored many friends. Peter, it's you. To be honest, I haven't been well recently. Juan sighed and said helplessly. I heard about the wedding, Juan. I'm sorry, but you can't be depressed like this. You have to cheer up. Peter said concernedly. After hearing Peter's words, Juan was moved. Thank you, Peter. I'm trying. I don't want this incident to ruin my life. His eyes revealed a hint of determination, as if he was cheering himself up. A month later, Juan decided to attend a business conference in Chicago. He stood in front of the mirror, looked at his slightly haggard face, and took a deep breath. I can't keep avoiding. I have to return to a normal life, he said to himself. At the opening cocktail party of the conference, Juan stood alone at the bar counter, holding a glass of whiskey in his hand. He watched the people around chatting and laughing, but there was an indescribable sense of loneliness in his heart. Is this seat taken? A gentle voice rang out beside his ear. Juan turned his head and saw a woman with charming auburn hair. Her hair was loosely tied into a bun and a few strands hung beside her cheeks, adding a few more charm. Her eyes were bright and energetic, with a kind of confidence and affinity. No, please sit. Juan replied politely. My name is Oakley. Nice to meet you. The woman smiled and introduced herself, and at the same time reached out her hand to shake hands with Juan. Juan held her hand and felt the warmth and strength from her hand. I'm Juan. Nice to meet you too, he said, his heart slightly moved, as if a long-lost warmth spread in the bottom of his heart. You seem to not like this kind of occasion very much. Oakley looked at Juan and tilted her head to ask. Juan slightly forced a bitter smile. You can say so. I just think it's a little noisy here. He didn't want to mention his painful experience in front of this newly met person. I can understand. Sometimes this kind of occasion can indeed make people feel a little tired. But since you're here, might as well relax, Oakley said with a smile. Her smile was as brilliant as the sunlight, making Juan's mood a little better. As time passed, the communication between Juan and Oakley gradually increased. They found that they had many common hobbies and each had their own life stories. During a dinner, Oakley looked at Juan with a hint of concern and curiosity in her eyes. Juan, I can sense that there seem to be many things hidden in your heart. If you want, you can tell me. Sometimes speaking out will make you feel better, but Juan hesitated for a moment. He looked at Oakley's sincere eyes and a desire to pour out arose in his heart. He took a deep breath and then slowly started to tell Oakley about the betrayal at the wedding, his pain and struggle in detail. Oakley listened quietly. Her expression remained focused and understanding. After Juan finished speaking, she gently held his hand and said, Juan, you've experienced too much pain. I feel bad for you, but you have to believe that this isn't your fault. You are a kind and loving person. Their betrayal only shows their problems, not yours. After hearing Oakley's words, a warm current flowed through Juan's heart. He looked at her movedly and said, Thank you, Oakley. Since this incident happened, I've always felt like a failure. It's you who made me see my value again. With Oakley's company and encouragement, Juan began to slowly walk out of the shadow. He picked up the paintbrush again. That was a hobby he loved in college but was put aside for many years because of family chores. When he picked up the paintbrush, he seemed to find a way to have a conversation with his inner self. Every stroke was like pouring out his inner emotions. He also began to recontact those old friends who he had alienated before. He gathered and chatted with them, sharing each other's lives. He found that true friends wouldn't leave him because of his encounter. Instead, they gave him more support and encouragement. However, there was still an unhealed wound deep in Juan's heart. The question of whether to forgive Lucia and the children had been bothering him. One day, when he and Oakley were walking in the park, Oakley suddenly asked Juan, Have you ever thought about reconciling with Lucia and them? Juan was silent for a while and then slowly said, I don't know, Oakley. Sometimes I think that after all, I once loved them and we spent so many wonderful times together. But whenever I think of their betrayal, my heart will be filled with anger and pain. I'm afraid of being hurt again. There was a hint of confusion and struggle in his eyes. It was like there were two little people fighting in his heart. Oakley gently held his arm and said, Juan, I understand your feelings. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or forgiving their mistakes. It's to free yourself from the burden of hatred. You can take your time. Don't force yourself. After hearing Oakley's words, Juan nodded thoughtfully. You're right, Oakley. I'll think about it carefully. He knew that this was a difficult journey that he needed to face in his heart, but he was willing to try to let go of the past hatred for his future. As time passed, Juan also made new breakthroughs in his career. He devoted more energy to his work, no longer working just for making money like before, but truly found his passion and value. His team members also felt his change. They admired and respected Juan more, and the working atmosphere became more positive. The children also began to contact Juan occasionally. Kora was the first to take the initiative to contact him. Her voice trembled and carried a hint of guilt on the phone. Dad, I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have kept it from you. I regret it. I miss you. Can we meet? After hearing Kora's words, Juan had mixed feelings in his heart. He hesitated for a moment and then said, Okay, Kora, we can meet. On the day of the meeting, Juan arrived at the appointed cafe early. He sat in the corner, looking at the door with both anticipation and nervousness in his heart. When Kora walked in, Juan saw that her eyes were red and swollen, as if she had just cried. Dad, Kora walked to Juan and couldn't help but shed tears. Juan looked at her. The anger and resentment in his heart seemed to have dissipated a little at this moment. Kora, sit down. What do you want to say? His voice was still a little cold, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. Dad, I'm really sorry. I know I hurt you. I was just afraid of losing our family at that time, so I didn't have the courage to tell you the truth, Kora choked and said. Juan gently sighed. Kora, do you know, once trust is broken, it's very difficult to build it again. Although there was still pain in his heart, seeing his daughter so guilty, he couldn't bear to blame her too much. I know, Dad. I will try to make up for my mistakes, as long as you give me a chance. Kora looked at Juan firmly, with hope in her eyes. The meeting with Kora was just the beginning. Later, the other children also had some communication with Juan one after another. Although each communication was full of awkwardness and caution, Juan could feel that they were also trying to repair the once broken relationship. After experiencing this series of events, John's life gradually got back on track. His relationship with Oakley was also heating up. One night, Juan carefully prepared a dinner. When Oakley came to his house, she was moved by the romantic scene in front of her. There were flowers and candles on the dining table, and the room was filled with warm music. Juan walked to Oakley. There was a ring in his hand, and his eyes were full of deep love and affection. "Oakley, since I met you, my life has changed a lot. You gave me strength and courage and made me find myself again. I love you. Will you marry me?" Oakley looked at Juan. Tears sparkled in her eyes. She nodded movedly. "Juan, I will." But their wedding was simple and warm, only inviting some closest friends and Oakley's family. Juan stood in front of the altar and watched Oakley walking slowly. His heart was filled with happiness and gratitude. He knew that he had experienced countless pains and struggles before finally reaching this step today. One evening after the wedding, Juan and Oakley stood on the balcony of their home, watching the sunset. "Juan, what are you thinking about?" Oakley leaned in Juan's arms and asked softly. Juan gently held her. There was a hint of emotion in his eyes. "I'm thinking about my life. It hasn't been easy along the way. I lost a lot, but also gained a lot. I'm glad that in my darkest moment, I had you by my side." His voice was calm and gentle, and his heart was full of expectations for the future. Oakley raised her head, looked at Juan, and smiled. "Juan, our future will be beautiful. Those painful pasts have passed. Now we have each other. This is the most important thing." Juan nodded. He looked at the sky in the distance. Although the pain in his heart was still there, it no longer made him unable to let go like before. He knew that he had regained his life and found his own happiness. At this moment, he felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction, as if all the hardships were just for welcoming this moment.